Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at Germany's adult guardianship system.
Ah, yes.
It's also known as Betreuungsrecht for those who keep up with German legal terms.
Of course.
And we had a lot of you request that we do a deep dive into this, and particularly the criticisms of it. And let me tell you, the legal analysis and the expert opinions that we've got, Priya, today are really, really thought-provoking.
This is such a complex system.
Yeah.
And there's so many ethical considerations at play. And one of the main things that always comes up is this idea of balancing the need to protect individuals who may not be able to manage their own affairs.
Right.
With ensuring their individual autonomy.
Yeah, finding that balance.
Right.
Yeah, finding that balance is so important.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive is, are German courts setting the bar too high when it comes to sound judgment? And what happens when somebody disagrees with their court-appointed guardian?
Yeah.
We're also going to be looking at how these routine legal procedures that are part of the system can actually add to a person's distress.
Yeah, and all of this really needs to be examined in the context of fundamental human rights.
Right.
Particularly the right to self-determination.
Right.
So, who gets to decide when someone can make their own choices, and how do we make sure that there isn't an abuse of power going on within this system?
Yeah, these are important questions, and I think maybe to start, we should look at how Germany's legal system actually defines free will.
Oh.
Because I have a feeling that's where things get a little tricky.
It definitely gets a little complicated there.
Yeah.
So the German Federal Court of Justice, or as they call it in Germany, the BGH, they use two main criteria to determine if somebody has free will.
Okay.
The first is Einsichtsfähigkeit. Einsichtsfähigkeit, which is essentially the ability to understand a situation. And then the second is the ability to then act based on that understanding.
Right.
So not only do you have to understand it, but you have to be able to use that understanding to make a choice and act.
Gotcha.
But to assess these two criteria, the BGH relies heavily on psychiatric experts.
So they're bringing in psychiatrists to decide whether or not someone's mind is working correctly enough to be able to make their own choices.
Right. And that's a lot of pressure to put on a psychiatrist, right?
I would imagine it is.
Because even leading psychiatrists and neuroscientists will admit that there's no definitive proof that free will exists.
Or doesn't exist.
Or doesn't exist, exactly.
So we're talking about, the courts basing these life-altering decisions on something that's essentially just a philosophical debate at this point.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
It's kind of scary.
It is, and it raises some concerns about subjectivity, right? Because how do you measure something that's essentially a philosophical concept?
Right.
And this is where a quote from Professor Dr. Norbert Nadopil, who's a prominent psychiatrist, really comes into play.
Okay.
He said, "There's no proof for or against free will.
Wow.
But there's enough room for freedom of will."
Enough room for freedom of will. That's a really powerful statement.
Yeah.
You think about the stakes here.
It is.
We're talking about people potentially losing their right to make choices about their own lives.
Yeah.
So we've got free will, which is obviously a lot more complicated than I think most people would initially think.
It is.
But then there's this other concept.
Yes.
This Einsichtsfähigkeit, this ability to have insight, which you were saying also plays a key role in the guardianship system.
Absolutely.
So can you maybe walk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, so Einsichtsfähigkeit is central to Betreuungsrecht.
Okay.
But here's something interesting to think about.
Okay.
In our daily lives, we make decisions based on instinct.
Yeah.
Personal preference, gut feeling, all the time.
All the time.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't have to justify our reasoning to a court of law every time we make a choice.
That's true.
So imagine having to explain to a judge why you chose one brand of coffee over another.
Oh my gosh.
Or why you turned down a job offer.
Right, like, well, Your Honor, it just didn't feel right.
Exactly. But when it comes to these guardianship proceedings, individuals are often required to demonstrate a much higher level of, let's call it, clear judgment than most of us ever have to.
This is inconsistent.
It seems inconsistent, right?
Like, why is there this heightened scrutiny just for people who might end up under guardianship?
Yeah, and the source material actually points out some interesting examples.
Oh, yeah.
To contrast this, So take employers, for instance.
Okay.
An employer can reject a job applicant.
Yeah.
Or even fire an employee.
Yeah.
During a probationary period. Without having to prove to a court that their decision was based on some kind of objective, sound judgment.
Right.
And lawyers, for example, can drop a client.
Yeah.
If they just feel like the chemistry isn't right.
Yeah, you don't have to have a legal justification or anything like that.
Right, exactly.
So why are these people who are facing potential guardianship being held to a different standard?
It's a good question, right?
It is.
And it raises some concerns about potentially unequal treatment, and it makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Does this disproportionately affect certain groups of people?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of things that raise concerns, let's talk about this declared will loophole.
Oh, yes.
That seems to have some pretty serious implications from what I understand.
It's definitely a very significant development in how this law is applied.
Yeah.
So, in 2023, Germany added a new provision to its family procedure code.
Okay.
It's section 294.3.
Okay.
And basically what it says is guardianship can be imposed even if someone explicitly says they don't want a guardian.
Hold on. So even if they say, I don't want this, the court can still be like, nope, you're getting one.
Well, there is a caveat.
Okay.
It requires that there is a review of the guardianship's proportionality within 2 years.
Okay, so how does that work?
So, according to a BGH decision from 2023,
okay.
It's 12 ZB 32123.
Okay.
This 2-year review is supposed to determine whether the guardianship was, quote, possible and necessary.
Okay.
Despite the person's initial opposition.
But wouldn't that mean that someone could be placed under guardianship for 2 years?
I could.
Against their will?
Potentially, yeah.
While the courts are trying to sort everything out?
Uh-huh.
I mean, that sounds like it could be incredibly disruptive to someone's life.
It could be very disruptive.
And not to mention, maybe even harmful.
Yeah, and this is one of the main criticisms of this new provision,
right?
Critics are saying this basically allows the state to experiment with guardianship on an individual.
Oh, wow.
And potentially at the cost of their well-being.
So it's basically like the court saying to them, well, we're going to give you 2 years to prove us wrong, and in the meantime, we're going to be the ones making the decisions about your life.
That's essentially what it boils down to, yeah.
It's scary.
And it really raises some concerns about whether there are adequate safeguards in place to protect individual rights, even when there are questions about a person's capacity for self-determination.
This is all so complicated, and listening to all this, it really makes me wonder if all this complexity within this system is actually working against the people it's supposed to be helping.
That's a really good point, and that's something we're going to delve into a little bit more as we continue this deep dive.
Okay, great. I'm fascinated to hear more about that.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, because you start to see how these well-intentioned procedures can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right. Yeah, I can't wait to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. After the break. We'll be right back. So you were saying that maybe all this complexity in the system isn't actually helping people?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about all those BGH cases. Mm-hmm. They get sent back down to lower courts for more scrutiny.
Right.
It seems like there's a lot of hesitation to just make a clear-cut ruling.
Yeah.
It's like this cycle of assessments and legal procedures, and I wonder if that ever really ends.
That's a good question, because from the perspective of the individual, imagine being told you may not be capable of making your own decisions.
Right.
And then you get stuck in this loop of evaluations and hearings. And
constantly know where you stand.
Being evaluated and judged.
It can be really unsettling.
Yeah, and it almost makes you feel like you're always on trial. Constantly having to prove your competence to the courts.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty dehumanizing.
It can be incredibly dehumanizing, yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of scrutiny can wear down someone's sense of self-worth.
Right.
And it can make it a lot harder to assert their own rights. Right.
And advocate for their needs.
Absolutely.
So it can become kind of this vicious cycle.
And it makes me think about the power dynamics at play here. You've got all these legal professionals, judges, all these experts in positions of authority.
Right.
And then you've got these individuals who are often very vulnerable, struggling with, all sorts of different challenges.
Yeah. They're trying to navigate this really complex system.
Right. It just doesn't feel like a fair fight at all.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes crucial to have strong safeguards to prevent abuse.
Right, to make sure that these people, their voices are heard, their perspectives are being respected, and that their rights are being protected at every step of the way.
Yeah, and maybe it's time to start thinking about this whole thing a little bit differently.
Oh, okay. How so?
So instead of approaching it from the angle of protecting people from themselves, maybe we should be focusing on empowering people to make their own choices, even if those choices might seem risky or unconventional to others.
Yeah, I like that. Because it's about empowering them.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that true autonomy means having the freedom to make mistakes, to learn from them, and to create your own path.
Yeah, even if it's messy.
Exactly. Even if it's messy.
Even if it looks different.
Even if it looks different from what we might consider the norm.
So as we're getting ready to wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways here for our listeners?
Well, I think the first thing is that free will is such a complex issue.
Right.
Even experts can't agree on what it means.
Right. And yet the courts are using it.
And yet it's at the core of legal systems that can drastically alter the course of people's lives.
Yeah, so we need to approach it very carefully.
We need to be really thoughtful about this.
Yeah.
With a lot of nuance and sensitivity.
Absolutely. And it's not about finding the right answer. It's about respecting people and their dignity and their autonomy and making sure that our systems are reflecting those values.
Exactly. And the second key takeaway is that guardianship laws can sometimes create these situations where individuals are held to a different standard.
Right, than everyone else.
Than other people.
Yeah.
And we have to make sure
absolutely
that these laws are being applied fairly and equitably.
Right. And making sure that it's not furthering, societal biases and things like that.
Absolutely. It comes back to that idea of challenging our own assumptions.
Yeah.
And making sure we're treating everyone with respect.
Regardless of whether or not we think they're capable.
Regardless of how we perceive their abilities.
And then finally, we were talking about all this procedural complexity.
Right.
And while it's meant to protect people, sometimes I think it has the opposite effect.
Sometimes it can create barriers for the very people it's designed to help. So we should be striving to make sure that these systems are efficient, accessible, and truly focused on the individuals and their well-being.
Yeah, I like that.
Really putting the individual at the center of it all.
Yes, systems that are focused on individual needs and well-being. I think that should be the ultimate goal.
Absolutely, and this is a conversation that needs to keep going.
It does.
And it needs to include the voices of the people who are most impacted by these systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to hear their stories.
Yeah.
We need to learn from their experiences and work together.
Yeah.
To create a more just and humane approach.
And on that note,
yes,
I think it is time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
As you go about your day today, think about how you interact with people who might be seen as different or vulnerable.
Good point.
Are your interactions grounded in respect?
Yeah.
Empathy?
Are you truly acknowledging their inherent worth as human beings?
That's such a powerful question.
It is, and I think it's one that all of us need to be asking ourselves.
It's a challenge for all of us to step outside of our comfort zones and examine our own biases.
But it's so important.
But it's essential if we want to create a world where everyone feels valued and respected and empowered.
And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us for this deep dive into Germany's adult guardianship system.
Thank you for having me.
And until next time, keep questioning.
Yes.
Keep challenging assumptions.
Absolutely.
And keep working towards a more just and equitable world for everyone.
That's a great way to put it.
Earlier we were talking about all those BGH decisions being sent back to lower courts.
Yeah.
For more scrutiny.
Uh-huh.
And it kind of makes me think about, there seems to be this hesitation to make clear-cut rulings in these cases.
Right.
And I wonder if that ever actually ends. That's a really good point.
Like, is it just this constant cycle of assessments and legal procedures?
From the perspective of the individual.
Yeah.
Imagine being told you might not be capable of making your own decisions.
Right.
And then being thrown into this system.
Right.
That's constantly evaluating you.
Yeah.
And judging you.
It's
got to be incredibly unsettling.
And it must feel like you're always on trial.
Yeah.
Constantly having to prove your competence.
Yeah, constantly having to prove yourself
was it courts
to these authorities.
And I think that is dehumanizing.
I agree. I think it can be incredibly